Behind every polished online build, every dramatic reveal, and every satisfying moment of welding sparks and engine noise, there is usually a second story that never makes it into the final edit. This is a story about one of those unseen chapters, the kind that unfolds quietly, away from uploads, comments, and expectations. The creator at the center of it all had built a reputation on ambition. His projects were bold, often oversized, and frequently experimental. Whether it was custom vehicle systems, off-road innovations, or workshop-scale fabrication challenges, his work depended on something very unromantic: stability. A stable shop, stable income, and a stable base to keep producing. But stability is exactly what kept slipping away. Over the course of several years, his life became a cycle of packing, relocating, rebuilding, and restarting. Each new workshop represented a fresh beginning, but also another financial risk and another emotional reset. What looked like progress from the outside was often just survival with better lighting. Eventually, the pressure stopped being background noise and became the main story. A failed project here, a broken lease there, and then a chain reaction that turned a dream relocation into a complete collapse of plans. The kind of collapse that doesn't just affect work, it affects where you sleep, where you store your tools, and whether your career can continue at all. This is the story of how a creator known for building impossible things found himself unable to maintain the most basic structure of all: a place to build them in the first place. The first confession. When the silence finally breaks. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come through a dramatic announcement, but through silence. Weeks passed without updates, uploads, or the usual behind-the-scenes progress viewers had come to expect. For a creator whose identity was built on constant making, the absence was noticeable. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the usual energy or excitement. Instead, it came as an unpolished confession, an admission that things in his life were not held together as neatly as his projects often appeared on camera. He stood in an empty industrial space, not a finished workshop, but a transition point, bare and echoing, like a metaphor for everything happening off-screen. He explained that he wasn't simply busy or working on something secret. He was trying to sort out his life. The phrasing was simple, but the weight behind it was clear. The version of himself that viewers saw online, confident, inventive, always building, didn't match how he actually felt day to day. There was humor in how he tried to soften it, but it didn't hide the exhaustion. Instead, it revealed it. He acknowledged that he felt like a mess, not in a dramatic or performative way, but in the quiet recognition that too many parts of his life had become unstable at once. And then came the context that changed everything. Another shop move. Not the first, not even the second, but the fourth relocation in just a few years. Each move had been justified at the time, each one framed as a step forward. But stacked together, they formed a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. This wasn't just a content creator changing spaces, it was someone repeatedly trying to rebuild the foundation of his entire career, while still standing on it. 4 workshops in 4 years, a pattern of instability. Looking back, the timeline of workshops reads less like a progression and more like a loop. The first space was small, limited in both location and capability. It worked only as a starting point, a place to begin learning and experimenting. But it was never designed for long-term growth. The next move was supposed to fix that. A larger workshop, cheaper rent, and more room for ambitious builds. On paper, it looked like the perfect upgrade. More space meant bigger projects, and bigger projects meant more content. For a while, it seemed like the plan was working, But reality inside a workshop is rarely as clean as the listing that gets you into it. Workflow inefficiencies, layout problems, and constant logistical compromises began to pile up. What looked like opportunities slowly became friction, and eventually, that friction turned into another decision: to move. The third workshop finally brought a sense of stability. For a time, things actually worked. Projects progressed more smoothly, content became more consistent, and there was a rare feeling that the foundation was solid. It felt like the system had finally clicked into place. But stability has a strange effect on people who are used to chaos and constant problem solving. Over time, even a good setup can start to feel restrictive. And that feeling eventually led to another idea: a new location, closer to family, closer to recreation areas, and closer to a different version of life that felt more balanced. That idea required commitment. Leases were ended, plans were made, and the future was rearranged around a new workshop that was supposed to anchor everything. But that anchor never arrived. The hurricane dream that fell apart, the decision to move, wasn't just about work. It was about life. The new location represented something more personal: proximity to family, easier access to supplies and services, and a lifestyle that felt less isolated. It was also near a landscape that matched his interests: open terrain ideal for testing vehicles and pushing mechanical designs to their limits. To make it happen, he committed fully. Existing leases were terminated, both for living space and workshop space. That kind of decision is irreversible in practice, even if it looks simple on paper. Once those contracts were exited, there was no easy way back. A new workshop in the desired area was secured. Everything seemed aligned. The transition plan was in motion, and for the first time in a while, the future looked structured again. It wasn't just a move, it was a full reset. Then everything changed with a single call. The new workshop deal, the one everything had been built around, was withdrawn. The space was no longer available. No replacement, no delay, just gone. The impact was immediate. Without the new workshop, there was no home base, no place for equipment, and no way to continue work. The carefully constructed plan collapsed in a matter of hours. What made it worse was timing. By the time the cancellation happened, other commitments had already been finalized. Existing leases were already terminated. There was no fallback option waiting in the background. What remained was a gap between where he had been and where he was supposed to go. And that gap had no obvious solution. Homeless and shopless. The point of no infrastructure. The phrase sounds extreme until it becomes literal. Without a workshop, there is no storage for tools, no space for projects, and no place to continue work. Without housing, there is nowhere to reset or regroup. In this case, both disappeared at the same time. Everything tied to the creator's work existed in physical form. Machines, steel stock, fabrication tools, project vehicles, and unfinished builds. None of it could simply be paused or stored digitally. It all needed space, and that space no longer existed. This created a cascading problem. Without a workshop, production stops. Without production, content stops. Without content, income slows or disappears. And without income, even temporary recovery becomes difficult to sustain. The emotional weight of that situation is often harder to describe than the logistical one. It isn't just about losing a building, it's about losing the structure that keeps an entire career functional. Every item packed into storage becomes a reminder of stalled progress. At this point, the situation was no longer a setback. It was a reset forced by circumstances rather than choice. Plans didn't just change, they evaporated. What made it more difficult was that this wasn't the result of a single mistake. It was the outcome of overlapping decisions, timing conflicts, and external changes that no longer aligned. And in that space of uncertainty, there was only one immediate priority: find anything that could function as a temporary base before everything stopped completely. A temporary lifeline. The new workshop opportunity. Just when the situation seemed to have no direction, another option appeared. Not the original dream location and not the ideal setup, but a nearby workshop space that became available unexpectedly. Its biggest advantage was geography. It was close enough to previous locations that moving equipment would not require a complete relocation to a new region. That alone changed the equation from impossible to barely manageable. The space itself wasn't perfect. It was smaller than what had been planned, but more efficiently laid out. That meant some compromises in storage and workflow, but also fewer wasted corners and more usable working zones. There was also external space, an important detail for fabrication work that often spills outside the walls of a building. That flexibility made the space far more practical than its square footage suggested. But this opportunity came with a strict constraint: time. There was already a commitment to travel for an off-road racing event, and that deadline couldn't be moved. Everything had to be packed, relocated and reset in a matter of days. This transformed the situation from a relocation into an emergency operation. There was no luxury of gradual transition. Everything had to happen quickly, efficiently, and with minimal disruption. Friends were called in to help. Equipment was sorted rapidly. Decisions about what went where had to be made on the spot, often while physically carrying heavy machinery. The workshop move became less about planning and more about execution under pressure. The 48-hour move, controlled chaos in motion. Moving a fully equipped fabrication workshop is not like moving a typical workspace. It involves heavy machinery, precision tools, and countless categorized parts that cannot simply be thrown into boxes. Everything has weight, value, and a specific place it needs to return to later. The timeline made it worse. With only 48 hours available, every task became urgent. Tool cabinets had to be drained, lifts disassembled, and structural equipment prepared for transport. Nothing could be left half-finished. What followed was organized chaos. Large equipment was maneuvered out of tight corners. Vehicles were used as temporary transport units. Every available surface became a staging area for sorting and loading. There was also an emotional layer beneath the physical work. Each object being packed represented hours, sometimes years, of accumulated effort. Nothing was just gear, it was history being boxed up under pressure. Despite the urgency, there was still structure in the process. Tasks were delegated, priorities were set, and progress was measured in completed zones rather than individual items. By the second day, exhaustion was visible, but so was progress. The old workshop was emptying out and the new one was beginning to take shape, even if it was far from complete. The move was not elegant, it wasn't clean or perfectly planned, but it worked just enough to prevent total shutdown. And in that moment, that was the only metric that mattered. The $10,000 mistake, the snow track failure. Among the boxes and forgotten corners of the old workshop, another story resurfaced, one that had been quietly buried under newer problems. It was a project built on ambition and confidence, custom snow tracks designed and fabricated in-house. The idea had seemed straightforward at the time. Instead of purchasing existing solutions, the decision was made to design and build a full custom system. The expectation was innovation, performance, and independence from commercial limitations. But engineering reality is rarely forgiving. The design placed extreme stress on components that were never meant to carry such loads. Under real-world weight and motion, structural weaknesses began to appear almost immediately. What had been built as a set of 4 complete units quickly revealed itself to be fundamentally flawed. Instead of refinement through testing, it became a full system failure across all units simultaneously. The financial impact was significant. Roughly $10,000 had been invested into materials, fabrication, and development. For an independent creator, that level of loss is not just a setback, it is a major constraint on future work. But the financial loss was only part of it. The greater burden came from the decision not to immediately share the failure. The project was set aside, not publicly explained, and gradually became a private source of frustration and regret. When rediscovered during the workshop move, it served as a reminder that not every ambitious idea reaches completion. Some become lessons stored in physical form, waiting to resurface at inconvenient times. Conclusion. When creation becomes survival. What unfolded over these years was not just a series of workshop changes or failed projects. It was a sustained period of instability where personal life, creative work, and financial pressure all became interconnected. At the center of it was a creator trying to maintain output in a system that depends heavily on physical space and equipment. Unlike digital work, fabrication cannot pause cleanly. When infrastructure disappears, so does the ability to create. Each relocation carried hope at the beginning. A better layout, a better location, or a better opportunity always seemed like the solution. But over time, those moves stacked into a pattern that became increasingly difficult to sustain. The breaking point was not a single event, but the accumulation of many. Failed deals, unexpected cancellations, financial losses, and the pressure of maintaining consistency in front of an audience while dealing with instability behind the scenes. What makes situations like this difficult is the contrast between perception and reality. Online, progress appears linear. In reality, it is often interrupted, reversed, and rebuilt multiple times before anything is shared publicly. Eventually, something had to give. The pause in uploads wasn't a disappearance. It was the result of everything collapsing into a period where rebuilding took priority over recording. In the end, the story is less about failure and more about the limits of constant rebuilding. Even highly capable builders cannot continue without a stable foundation. And sometimes the most important part of creation isn't the next project. It's finding a place where building can actually continue.